T'as fini?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, Michael, we're ready to go.
Good afternoon, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Michael Shifter, President of the Inter-American Dialogue, and on behalf of the Dialogue and our partner organization in Haiti, Quisqueya University, we are very pleased and proud to present today's very timely event, Haiti's Crisis Deepens, What Must Be Done Now. In recent months, the already dire situation in Haiti has deteriorated. Haiti's president was assassinated in early July, and last month, the country's southern coast suffered a catastrophic earthquake, followed by Hurricane Grace that left more than 2,000 dead and many survivors without shelter and sufficient food. And now, several thousand of the more than 12,000 Haitians who had encamped at the Texas border town of Del Rio have been deported to Haiti by U.S. immigration officials. Today, we are very fortunate to have a first-rate panel to focus on what needs to be done to effectively address these intersecting and reinforcing crises. Among many questions, our expert speakers will discuss how best to assist the victims of earthquakes and floods, how to help restore a functioning government, how to relieve the humanitarian burden of so many Haitian citizens, and how the international community and the Biden administration and other governments can best support Haiti to confront its multiple challenges. This will be the third public event in the past year, co-hosted by Quisqueya and the Dialogue. The two institutions are now working together to develop Think Tank Haiti, an independent network of Haitian researchers and policy analysts. The network will conduct research on the governance, economic, and other core problems facing the nation, seek to identify practical responses, and widely disseminate the results in Haiti and internationally. I want to thank members of the steering committee for their time and commitment to this very important initiative, and also recognize two colleagues from the Dialogue who have been deeply engaged, Peter Hakem and Joan Caivano, who helped organize this event. I also want to thank Gaston Ocampo for all of his assistance. I want to let the audience know and participants know that we welcome your questions and comments. Please feel free to use the Q&A function on Zoom, and also email or email any questions you have to meetings@thedialogue.org. I'm very privileged now to give the floor to our partner, Jackie Lumarque, who has kindly agreed to offer welcoming remarks. Jackie has been rector of Quisqueya University since 2007. He previously served as the president of the Regional Conference of Rectors, Presidents, and Directors of Universities in the Caribbean from 2012 to 2019. You can find his full impressive bio on our website. Jackie, turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Good evening, everyone. Talking about Haiti today is not an easy task, because we are talking about a country which for over 3 decades has experienced disasters and catastrophes, both natural and man-made. We have seen hurricanes, coup d'etat, cholera, an earthquake in 2010, COVID-19, daily kidnappings, another earthquake in 2021, more hurricanes, mass killings, a presidential assassination, and recently the massive deportation by the United States of thousands of Haitians who had escaped their hell many years ago. State institutions have been systematically and illegally dismantled by the current regime. There is no parliament. There have been no elections. There is no Supreme Court, no legal order, and ultimately no regard for the Constitution. It seems to be that there is a culture of disregard for the rule of law by the political class in Haiti. Our short history has already produced 22 constitutions, most of them conceived to serve specific interests and in direct opposition to the common good. Since its adoption, the current constitution has lost all value and is regularly ignored in favor of informal arrangements, which are best described as a sort of illegal interference to bypass political deadlock. Since the coup against Aristide in 1991, no less than 15 such accords have been signed, most of them stillborn and with no real impact on the crisis. The current de facto Prime Minister just published another of these documents in the official gazette, which only reflects his own blatantly partial and biased version of a national dialogue. There is a good chance that it will meet the same fate as its predecessors. The situation looks really desperate, but we must stand up and fight. This is why Quisqueya University and the Dialogue have set up Think Tank Haiti, a collaborative initiative intended to assemble a network of prominent Haitian scholars and policy researchers, principally from Haiti, the United States, and Canada. I think now is the time for an inflection point in the history of this nation. Can we unite to launch a deeper reflection on where we are and where we want to go? A reflection that is grounded in a fresh vision for Haiti and which is designed by Haitians for today and for the future. This indeed requires listening to and understanding the will of the entire population and not just that of the political class in Port-au-Prince, which has become so disconnected from the rest of the Haitian society. This demands a truly comprehensive effort, a truly national and inclusive dialogue, genuine negotiations to establish principles of governance and to design mechanisms which build a culture of the rule of law, accountability, and efficiency, drawing from best practices. This can pave the way to a new constitution and credible elections in which no ambassador or group of ambassadors can pick the winner. It is within this context that the international community can play a more productive and supportive role. Once Haiti's citizens have had the opportunity to chart their own course, they will absolutely need international support, but without international puppeteering, as Special Envoy Daniel Foote wrote in his resignation letter. What needs to be done? Addressing the gang problem is the first priority, given the inefficiency and the complicity of the existing government with these criminal groups. These groups are not fighting for a political cause. They kill, rob, and kidnap only for money, and they are interconnected with politicians and the police. They control most of Port-au-Prince, disrupt the economy of the entire country, and have deliberately hindered the relief efforts in the south following the earthquake. During a conference organized by Quisqueya University 2 years ago, on the theme of governance and security, the participants concluded that insecurity was squarely a choice of governance. President Jovenel Moïse, in order to resist his political opponents, sought the support of the G9, a federation of 9 gangs, just as past presidents did before, with private militias called Chimera or Totomakut during the Diwali regime. This latest incarnation is the ongoing consequence of a cynical political scheme designed by the politicians to maintain power and control the electoral process. This is why it is so difficult for many Haitians to understand the rationale of the demand by the State Department and OAS to organize hasty elections without frontally addressing the gang problem first. Let a real transitional government, one built on consensus, start this fight. And then will the international community support this urgent call to action on basic security? Another priority is looking after the victims of the earthquake. Today, power struggles absorb all of the government's energy and attention. As always, many humanitarian organizations have been very, very active during the emergency phase. And I'm particularly proud of our Haitian diaspora, which has demonstrated a welcome spirit of self-organization and proactivity. However, a more systematic response is needed, a response that the existing government has proven unable to provide. Robust coordination at the local and national levels and proper mechanism to guarantee accountability and transparency in order to avoid patronage and nepotism need to be implemented. We have learned many, many lessons from the 2010 tragedy, and we understand that the primary responsibility of helping our fellow citizens must rest upon the Haitian government. But this implies a real and legitimate government with solid policies and accountable procedures to raise resources and spend them for the benefit of the most vulnerable. And while we attend to the most vulnerable, we must also chart a broader path for Haiti. For 4 years, our university has been conducting studies in each of Haiti's 572 communal sections, that is the lowest municipal level, with the goal of assisting them in establishing in a participatory way local development plans, using the framework of the United Nations Strategic Development Goals. This is the very first time in Haiti that institutional data have been collected at this level, and also the first time the voices of this part of the population have a chance to be heard. This is a new bottom-up approach that can pave the way for a new paradigm of cooperation, where Haiti puts the local communities at the center of its development agenda. To conclude this conversation, I would like to address the recent massive deportation to Haiti of families who have been disconnected from the country for years, and more specifically, the way they have been treated by DHS. Apart from being a shock to a collective human conscience, I have no doubt that this will exacerbate the Haitian crisis. But make no mistakes, it is also a challenge for the United States, which must reflect on the values and morals that are central to how it sees itself as a nation, and the contradiction with its actions that the world has just witnessed. These migrants are victims who deserve respect and care. Why are they treated as criminals? Beyond compassion, is it not our responsibility to find humane short and long-term solutions, and to ensure that this never happens again. An existence where the rich exist in comfort while surrounded by massive poverty and total despair cannot be our desired future. We have no choice but to work towards common goals where prosperity is accessible to all, wherever we live, as envisaged by Agenda 2030 through the 17 Sustainable Development Goals established by the United Nations. No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education for all, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, decent work and economic development, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and so on. How can we be more relevant in a global agenda for humanity? So the way to this common future is already drawn. Why can't we stand up and fight for it? The United States must see its future as a shared future for the Americas, without forgetting the Caribbean. Haiti will need its support and resources if we're going to be able to overcome the challenges that we're facing today. But if we work together in common understanding of a truly democratic vision for Haiti, I know that we can succeed. I'm sure that our brilliant panelists will address these issues with the necessary depth, and I thank them for their participation. Special thanks also to Jacqueline Charles for putting her talent at our disposal for the moderation of the panel. I wish you a fruitful conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jackie. We now, for those excellent remarks that I think will frame our discussion extremely well, we now have some opening remarks from Congressman Andrew Levin, who represents the 9th Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives and the member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. So let's turn to his opening remarks.
Yes. Bonsoir tout le monde. Moi, t'as vraiment venu parler avec vous en personne, mais c'est pas possible. Hi, I'm Andy Levin. I represent Michigan's 9th District in Congress. It's such an honor to talk to you today about a topic about which I feel so passionately and on which I've worked for decades. And that is, how can we best support the Haitian people to fulfill their aspirations and enjoy their full human rights? At such a pivotal moment in our country's relationship, I'm grateful for this chance to share briefly with you my thoughts on where we are and where we go from here. First, let me share a little bit about myself and my history with Haiti. I learned to speak Haitian Creole while organizing Haitian nursing home workers in Boston back in the early 1980s. I'd later serve as an observer to the first attempt at democratic elections in Haiti in 1987, following the end of the Duvalier dictatorship. I watched in horror at a polling place in Carrefour as anti-democratic forces sprayed would-be voters with bullets. It was a miracle no one was killed. Later, I saw the aftermath of the massacre of voters who were simply trying to exercise their right to vote at the École Argentine elementary school. I spent my first summer of law school in 1992 traveling throughout Haiti in all of the départements for Human Rights Watch, and was the principal investigator and writer for that organization's book-length report called Silencing a People, which essentially looked at what happened in the aftermath of the first overthrow of Jean-Bertrand Aristide. Since then, I've published writings on Haitian civil society and what an effective US policy to support democracy and economic development in Haiti would actually look like. And then in 2018, I was elected to the Congress. And I immediately sought out a seat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as a seat on its Western Hemisphere subcommittee. And then at the beginning of this Congress, I created a Haiti caucus in the Congress for the first time in a long time. And I sought out co-chairs who represent districts with large Haitian diaspora populations, one each in Florida, Val Demings, in New York, Yvette Clarke, and in Massachusetts, Ayanna Pressley. And we are rocking and rolling, fighting for democracy and human rights in Haiti. I'm really committed to bringing this experience to bear in a way that moves U.S. Haiti policy in a more positive direction, because I believe strongly that a new direction is truly necessary. Last week, we saw horrifying images at the U.S. border, coupled with unconscionable deportations of Haitian migrants seeking asylum in the United States. These violent tactics and deportations must stop, period. And I'll continue working to see that they do. Today, however, I wish to focus on Haiti's crisis of governance. The murder of Jovenel Moïse was a devastating example of the extent to which the security situation in Haiti has unraveled. But it should not have been shocking to anyone who follows Haiti closely. For several years, and especially in the months before, violent actors have terrorized the Haitian people with impunity, while the international community, the United States included, I fear, failed to heed their cries to change course. If we wish to be a true friend to the Haitian people, we must see them and empower them and all their rich groups in civil society to rebuild after this tragedy. I believe the best way to do that is to support the Citizen Conference for a Haitian Solution to the Crisis and their August 30th agreement for a Haitian solution to the crisis, a roadmap for a true Haitian-led democratic transition. That agreement's been signed by over 600 individuals representing most major political parties, bar associations, human rights organizations, peasant groups, women's groups, labor unions, business groups, religions, and more. Building the democracy that this agreement envisions will require free and fair elections, for sure, but not ones that are rushed and cannot produce credible results. I know, having witnessed what I did in 1987, how critical it is that we get this right and ensure that the conditions necessary for real elections are in place. A democracy cannot flourish if voters are intimidated, harassed, even killed for participating in it. That isn't true democracy, nor is one in which power players hash out leadership posts in back rooms or in foreign capitals. Please know that I will work tirelessly alongside my colleagues and partners in Congress, in the diaspora, and in Haiti on this and other issues. And that as long as I'm in Congress, the Haitian people will have an advocate in me in the US Capitol. Kembe Ferm.
Thank you very much, Congressman Levin, for those remarks. And now I'm really delighted to introduce the moderator for our discussion, Jacqueline Charles, who will also introduce our terrific speakers. Jacqueline is the Caribbean correspondent with Miami Herald, where she's reported on the Caribbean since 2006. She's won many, many awards, including the Maria Morris Cabot Prize in 2018. She's done really superb, outstanding reporting on Haiti. And we once again welcome her to a Dialogue Quisqueya event. Jacqueline, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me here today as we welcome everyone to this distinguished panel. I'm hoping everybody can hear me. So among our guests today, our panelists, Michelle Duvivier-Pierre-Louis. She's a former prime minister who also served as Minister of Justice and Public Security. Upon leaving office in November 2009, she resumed her activities at FOCAL as president coordinating special projects. Pierre-Louis is also a professor at University Quisqueya, Haiti. Pierre-Louis holds a degree from Queens College of New York and has received several awards and distinctions in her career. Next, we have Amy Willens, an award-winning journalist and writer. She is a professor of English at the University of California, Irvine, where she teaches in the literary journalism program. She received a 2013 National Book Critics Circle Award for her memoir, Farewell, Fred Voodoo, A Letter from Haiti. as well as a 2020 Guggenheim Fellowship in General Nonfiction. Willens was the Jerusalem correspondent for The New Yorker and is a contributing editor at The Nation. We also have Juan Gabriel Valdez. He's a former Foreign Affairs Minister of the Republic of Chile from 1999 to 2000 and Ambassador of Chile to the US, 2014 to 2018. He previously served as Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Chile to the United Nations, Ambassador of Chile to the Republic of Argentina, and Ambassador of Chile to the Kingdom of Spain. From 2004 to 2006, he was the special representative of the Secretary General of the UN and chief of the UN mission known as MINUSTA in Haiti. Valdez holds an MA in Latin American Studies at the University of Essex, England, a PhD in political science from Princeton University, and he also has numerous teaching affiliations as well. And last but not least, we have Patrick Gaspar. He is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Center for American Progress and the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Gaspar most recently served as the President of the Open Society Foundation, one of the largest private philanthropists in the world. Gaspar was a key figure in President Barack Obama's administration and held a number of prominent positions during Obama's 2 terms in office, including serving as U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of South Africa during Obama's 2nd term. From 2009 until 2011, he was the assistant to the president and director of the White House Office of Political Affairs. He also served as the associate director of personnel for the Obama transition and a national political director for the historic 2008 campaign. Gaspar was born in Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo, to Haitian parents, grew up in New York, and has a long career there nationally in organized labor, election politics, and public service. Gaspar attended Columbia University and is the recipient of honorary doctorates from Columbia University and Bard College. I want to thank all of you for being here, and we're going to start with opening remarks from former Prime Minister Michel Pierre-Louis.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. Earthquake that hit the south of Haiti on August 14, followed by a tropical storm, revealed once again the fragility of our environment and the precarious living conditions of millions of people. The catastrophe occurred in a political vacuum, a constitutional and judicial imbroglio, a disastrous economic situation in a gang-controlled territory. The current makeshift government had little to no capacity to intervene and has left the field to international donors and agencies and to local organizations that could respond rapidly. For the most part, it has left the population to fend for themselves. Another illustration of our structural dependency. And as if to add to our calamitous situation, we saw the horrific images of what happened under the Del Rio Bridge and in the border river crossing in Texas, causing legitimate national and international outcry and outrage. White American horsemen chasing and apparently whipping defenseless Black Haitian migrants, bringing slavery back to our collective memory. The detour through history could help us understand why Haiti is still to this day a reservoir of cheap labor. When under the military occupation of Haiti, the Marines introduced the corvée, this forced unpaid labor, a reminder of slavery, it was rejected by the peasant smallholder farmer population. Yet considered to be backward and unfit for civilization, a racist choice was made to use their bodies as cheap, unskilled labor in Haiti and in the region. The first major forced migration of Haitians, mostly farmers, was organized in the 1920s under the military occupation for the benefit of US sugar companies in Cuba and in the Dominican Republic. we see the consequences to this day. And we see also the visceral rejection of Black Haitian migrants on your shores and your borders. Yet in a book, Taking Haiti, Military Occupation and the Culture of Imperialism, 1915-1940, American scholar Mary Renda offers a different reading that shows a profound understanding of the situation. And I quote, Haitian peasants had struggled to establish a peasant economy and to resist forces urging them toward plantation wage labor. Picking coffee and growing food for themselves and for the market in their own garden plots afforded greater levels of control over their lives than plantation agriculture would allow. They worked body and soul for independence. We are no longer in the days of the big stick, the gunboat, the dollar, and the missionary diplomacy advocated by successive US presidents at the beginning of the 20th century to establish their hegemony on the continent. Yet we cannot help asking ourselves why the political and economic choices made in the course of history to this day seem to always be detrimental to our country. And more persistently, why in a small country like Haiti, it is still not possible to educate, to create decent jobs, to acknowledge the fundamental role of smallholder farmers, men and women in the economy, and to invest with them to fight food security and help mitigate natural disasters. I don't need to go to the numbers. I don't need to go to the indicators. We've seen them all already. Millions in foreign aid have been wasted in unsuccessful ventures. Then why not invest in areas that really matter in the long run, that can open perspectives to millions of young men, young women who could finally project themselves in the future of the country? Migration is a worldwide issue, a consequence of bad governance, wars, chronic inequalities, prejudices, climate change. Considering the state of the world and the fragility of today's democracy, this could be a long-lasting trend. The Haitian diaspora, from all social and economic backgrounds, is still fighting, struggling to find its place while continuing to support families in Haiti. In the meantime, there are issues that cannot wait. And contrary to the injunctions that we receive, it is not the elections that cannot wait. We need time now to build the Haitian democratic institutions that will make good Haitian elections possible. It is the time for our regional friends and neighbors to help us. We need to build Haitian solutions. And at the same time, we must face actual challenges and understand the critical importance of the environment. Paradoxically, catastrophes also offer opportunities. What happened in the South is an eye-opener. Science keeps warning us that this could happen anywhere else in the country with graver consequences, more suffering, and probably more migrations. Now is the time to change the way we look at our country, at our territory, our population, our habitat, to protect our biodiversity. We need to build scientific capacities, and I'm glad the university is part of this venture. We need to build scientific capacities to educate, to empower, and to bridge the social divide that has for too long marginalize millions of men and women in Haiti. This is the real audacious political agenda for the next generation that I dream of for my country. Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Pierre-Louis. Now we're going to go to Amy Willens for your remarks.
Hi. I wanted to thank the dialogue and Quisqueya for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here among such illustrious colleagues, friends. Haiti suffers under many burdens. It has too much singular history to carry for such a small country, burdens and history that still has echoes to this day. It has its cruel beginnings as a giant work and death camp for African enslaved people. Its arguably premature but earth-shaking revolutionary victory against Napoleon. Its mistaken centuries-long payments of billions of dollars in reparations to France, creating the kinds of inequalities we see in Haiti today, and its cruel 19-year occupation by the US Marines. That's the history, that's only some of its amazing history. Then there's geography. Haiti has two neighbors who've caused it a lot of trouble, Cuba and the United States. Cuba's nearness meant that the capitalist world feared that Haiti might become part of a communist blanketing of Latin America. Thus, the US, no matter what pablum it spouted and still spouts, has opposed freedom and democracy for Haiti for hemispheric economic reasons. And because even after the fall of the Soviet Union, it still feared ongoing global South ideals of freedom, equality, autonomy, and sovereignty. And the US is so close, it has never stopped interfering. And then there's so much related tragedy in recent years and suddenly in recent months. As we say in the title of this gathering today, Haiti's crisis deepens. This doesn't happen for no reason. Geopolitical tragedies are not idiopathic. Right now, there's a stranglehold on Haiti. Those with their hands around the neck of the Haitian economy and the Haitian people benefit from this. Those who are controlling the country and encouraging its gangs and massacres and its crazy minute-by-minute street violence, they profit. And by profit, I mean profit, as in money. Over the past decade, the 2010 earthquake relief and reconstruction monies brought them untold stolen riches. The Venezuelan Petrocaribe funds also provided some with an enormous slush fund, not to mention what has been siphoned off at every border through customs or protection. With all that money flow and theft, plus embezzlement, graft, blackmail, and kidnap ransoms, a handful of powerful characters have enriched themselves at princely rates with impunity. Those who back these figures and their political frontmen and have kept them in power, that is to say, the United States State Department under Presidents Obama, Trump, and Biden, and the embassy in Port-au-Prince directing it all, aided and abetted by a largely silent and prostrate poor group, have reasons that are more obscure than those of the people now, quote, running, unquote, Haiti. But once the US has put a group in power, the US likes to keep them there for reasons of continuity and control and familiarity. Also, the embassy, of course, doesn't want to lose face by admitting that its entire Haiti strategy, if you can glorify it with that name, has been an utter failure. Under the embassy's rule, with Presidents Michel Martelly and Jovenel Moïse as chosen figureheads and disastrously corrupt ones, the nascent democracy that Haiti had in place since 1987 has been utterly destroyed. At first, the legislature was rapidly dissolved, then the judiciary was wrecked, and also the provincial governments by attrition. And finally, interestingly, if you think about it, the presidency itself, which since the assassination of President Moïse in July, exists no longer except in the imagination and in the much ignored Haitian constitution. There is no government in Haiti now, as we have seen with the new earthquake, and no structure of government. Only a selected regent exists, chosen by a dead president and the embassy, and that is de facto Prime Minister Ariel Henry and his cabinet of sycophants. Here's the unvarnished truth. Since the 2010 earthquake, the United States has continued its repugnant experiment with running Haitian governments. Some Haitians even feel by now that it truly is an experiment, as if Haiti, with all its troubles, is nothing more to the Americans than a test tube, a petri dish for running tests and collecting data. Anyway, I think that by now we can safely say that that experiment has been an unmitigated disaster. Biden himself pointed out when reinstating TPS that Haiti is no longer safe enough or functioning enough for the US to return Haitians to it. When Biden made that statement and continued TPS, he was effectively condemning his own country's policies in Haiti, effectively declaring failure. People who pay no attention to Haiti might not recognize this, but probably everyone watching this meeting understands the irony. That said, he continued those policies. This is not logical foreign policy making, nor is the illegal airlift of not yet 12,000, but perhaps 12,000 hungry, homeless Haitians at Del Rio right back into that unsafe, non-functioning place. It's not a recipe for greater stability in Haiti, which is crucial if the US doesn't want more refugees and migrants at the Texas border or on its Florida shores. All of this said, weirdly, I'm very hopeful right now. I think we all are, which is why we're here today. This is a moment of opening and of possibility. As Michel Pierre-Louis just said, catastrophes can be moments of opportunities. Okay, so what should be done? Look, I'm a journalist. I am not a politician. If I were, I think I'd be wringing my hands over Haiti, but I never can wring my hands. But I think one thing that we need right away is new personnel at the embassy. Then we need to deal with what's happening in Del Rio in proper humanitarian fashion, as Professor Lamarck said. Since the American policies of the last decade have resulted in theft, corruption, disintegration of community, economy, justice, and democracy in Haiti, let's abandon them. Tell the regent, de facto Prime Minister Henry, his services are no longer needed. Likewise, the political accord he cobbled together in a few days with embassy advice to try to give a gloss of democracy to his rule. Let's say goodbye to them, nice try, and bonne chance. And then let's finally agree, as we have known for months, that the Commission for a Haitian Solution to the Crisis, of which Congressman Levin spoke earlier, as did others, is the only viable, reliable, responsible, and cooperative option right now for a solution to the crisis, with solid ideas about justice, electoral democracy, education, job creation, sanitation, shelter, security, and other important human needs, as well as the return of stolen Haitian funds and monies. The Commission is what Haiti has to offer when and if the United States can finally turn its bedazzled gaze away from the PHTK and the contentious Martelly Moïse crowd. I won't enumerate the excellent qualities of the Commission or the seriousness of its efforts in the past half a year to put together a strong proposal with strong backing from all sectors of Haitian society to save the nation. Just check out the Montana Accord and its signatories and look at the respected people who've worked to put the whole thing together to move the country with reasonable speed and deliberation and democratic ideals toward an election for president and legislature that will have democratic validity. Let's show allyship, a big word in America now, with the Haitian people. And let's accompany them down this difficult road away from the chaos and horror that our mistaken policies have created and enabled. We can certainly direct resources to Haitian actors if requested, but never should the Americans push or lead or demand or require. Don't be the master. So much US history with Haiti is about the US showing its mastery over the Haitians. That's over and must end. Part of the support and collaboration the United States can offer obviously means cooperating with Haitians about how to pacify and disarm the dozens of gangs in the country and help ensure that ammunition for their heavy arms is no longer entering Haiti. A transition to real democratic rule won't be easy and probably won't be entirely peaceful, or it will remove from powerful armed groups and political factions the continuing flow of ill-gotten gains, as well as ending petty thefts and corruption that have been encouraged everywhere in what passes for the political system. To paraphrase a Haitian saying, the burden is heavy, but with many hands, it can be carried, and the serious work of governing a desperate nation can begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Now we're going to go to Juan Gabriel Valdez.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I thank the Inter-American Dialogue and my friend Michael Shifter and Quisqueya University for this invitation. From Chile, where I live, I have been following with an enormous alarm the recent developments in Chile, in Haiti, very much caught by the sense of helplessness that invades those who have tried to serve with honesty and respect in the past the interest of the Haitian people. I feel particularly impressed by the tragedy of those who tried to reach the United States 2 weeks ago, particularly because most of them came from Chile, and they had walked or gone by bus for more than 5,000 kilometers. During these years, we have suffered with the situation of Haitian refugees in Chile. While some have been able to establish themselves and their families finding jobs and decent houses, a majority continues to confront, I fear, the sometimes distance, but very often racism of a part of the Chilean population that had no recollection or memory of Black immigration in the country. This is a situation, therefore, that affects not only Haitians, it affects those of us in Latin America who have not only tried to accept, tried to receive, but to favor the immigration of some part of the Haitian population to our country. This seems to be, in fact, a hopeless situation. What we saw under Jovenel Moïse, we had seen before. His atrocious death does not change the fact that his road to autocracy was not original. The script is too well known. The president does not call for elections and allows institutions to weaken or disband. Without a parliament and with a judiciary power intimidated or directly repressed, the president becomes increasingly autocratic. The government tolerates or directly supports the armed gangs, allows the police to be infiltrated or decomposed. The president decides not to respect the constitution, although in this case it was even worse. He decided to reform it, calling for a referendum which was explicitly forbidden in the same constitution. But what we hadn't seen before, or let me say, since the moment in which I got involved with Haiti, I hadn't seen before, was the attitude of the international community. Instead of confronting this well-known trend of anti-democratic evolution, it supported it. Instead of observing the enormous dangers that pose the violence of the gangs, the futility of the police, or appreciating the enormous dimensions of the mass demonstrations taking place in Haiti at the time, it decided to close ranks with the government. As Michael Jean has said recently, the message of the masses in the streets was clearly, crystal clear. What they were saying was, we want transparency, we want accountability, we want respect for the rule of law and justice for all. But the international community looked elsewhere. It decided to support the government against what it saw as chaos. When preparing these notes, I remember a small incident that says a lot about the present moment. After the first round of the 2010 elections, I traveled to Port-au-Prince with former Prime Minister of France, Lionel Jospin. In a meeting with a core group, we clearly saw that the results of the election would be changed. Without explaining how, one of its members, one ambassador, said that the second round had to be called as soon as possible. The former Prime Minister of France asked, how can you call for a second round if you do not have the results of the first round? The response outraged Lionel Jospin. Mais c'est Haïti, Monsieur le Premier Ministre, c'est Haïti. This idea of disrespect, of abuse of the processes, institutional processes of Haiti, I think was the origins of the present tragedy that the country is facing. If we look at the resignation of a special envoy, Ambassador Daniel Foot, we realize there is no agreement at present and there is no solution coming from the international community. The only solution for Haiti is Haitians themselves. There is no clarity on how the international community could support a sense of minimal legitimacy in a country that seems to have lost all trust in political institutions and elections, except if we concede to the civil society the possibility of reorganizing the country itself. It is difficult to understand that the international community, instead of rejecting the idea of organizing another hit-and-run elections, does not listen to what is new in the country, the extraordinary surge of the civil society and its initiative to pursue a national dialogue on the reorganization of politics and society in Haiti. Nothing is easy, and it is clear, as most of the participants today have mentioned, that the solution needs an enormous effort of not only development and work by the Haitians and effort of agreement between the Haitians, but also of support of the international community. But it is clear that only civil society can develop this sort of effort. I've been told that the civil society organizations have legitimacy but do not have power. Let us provide from an international network of friends of Haiti the power they need. The national dialogue seems to me to be the only way forward. And as Jacques Lumac has mentioned, there is now an opportunity. The Biden administration should very seriously consider the opportunity that is open on Haiti today. That is the possibility of supporting the alternative that reconvenes the legitimacy of the people instead of supporting the continuation of an illegitimate past. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick Gaspar.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, and thank you to the university and to the Inter-American Dialogue for taking up this initiative. Ambassador Valdez at the very end of his statement just said that he understands that the civil society groups have legitimacy, authenticity on the ground, but they lack power, and that there's something that we all should be doing to help galvanize and animate that power with them. I'm struck by the irony of that when one considers that they are operating in a context where the U.S. Embassy has considerable power with just a tweet. With just a tweet, the U.S. Embassy, the U.S. ambassador seem from day to day, week to week, to be able to designate who the prime minister is going to be, who's interim, who's acting, and who can legitimately succeed. So it's interesting to see this profound chasm and disparity in where power is located. And I hope that as we get into the less formal part of this panel discussion, we can interrogate that a bit. When I received this invitation and I saw that Amy Willent and Michel Pierre-Louis were going to be participants in it, that compelled me to have to say yes. Amy, in her bold writing, stiffens the spine of many of us in the diaspora and gives us the fuel that we need for our argumentation. And Michel Pierre-Louis, every single day that she steps outside of her home and raises her voice, is putting everything on the line. And so I thought it was important to be able to support their interventions. But I'm also here for those who have no capacity to be here, for individuals like the journalist Diego Charles and the feminist activist Antoinette Duclair, who were mercilessly gunned down a few months ago. In my last visit to Haiti, I was taken by my friends to Martin Park, into a corner of Martin Park that they designated l'espace de parole, the space of talk, the space of speech. We have to extend a kind of safe haven for speech throughout Haiti and throughout the diaspora. I'm excited, as Amy is, about this moment. I share her kind of odd and radical optimism, irrespective of earthquakes and storms, assassinations, and the madness at the border that I witnessed firsthand when I went to bear witness and to lend my solidarity at Del Rio on Thursday of last week. I share Amy's optimism because we have seen a maturation of Haitian civil society that culminated in the coming together and the accord signed in the Montana. But I'm also really inspired by the new sophistication and the muscular advocacy that we are seeing from the Haitian diaspora, of which I am proud to call myself one. At the beginning, Jackie said that it's not enough for the Haitian diaspora to just be reactive, and now there needs to be a kind of ongoing coherence to that advocacy, and I suspect that that is beginning to happen. That gives me some optimism. I'm also taking up some hopefulness now in a moment when it's become obvious because of the quote crisis of migration, it's become obvious that the US has to work in much deeper partnership with multilateral stakeholders throughout Latin America if they are going to be able to stem the tide at the borders. That will accrue to the great good benefit of Haitians in Latin America, but also Haitians on the island as well, but only if that work is taken up with a lack of hubris. So in the rest of my brief intro, I want to make two suggestions about what needs to occur in the way going forward. And one of those suggestions will involve a tool of fiscal accountability that I hope will kind of seize some imaginations. As I think about the way forward for Haiti, I think it's really important to reset the kind of trope that we always have every time there's a crisis in the country. The former French ambassador to Haiti, Ambassador Didier Lebré, following the assassination, he stated that Haiti is tragic, unruly, and ungovernable. That lends itself to this trope that Haiti is like Job and supernatural occurrences happen there all the time and we just throw up our hands and there's nothing we can do about it. I think that Haiti is less like Job and more like another myth, which is the myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus pushes that rock up that hill, but there is a kind of phenomena that we can name that is man-made that pushes that rock right back down on Haitians themselves. Because this is a man-made phenomena and not a supernatural one, it is one that is not intractable, and it's therefore exceedingly solvable. It is absolutely solvable. When you consider that one of the great challenges that we have in Haiti right now is the proliferation of guns and violence, and when you consider that there are more guns in Haiti today than existed before the long UN intervention in Haiti, and when you understand that I'm having this conversation with you from the nation that is the #1 exporter of guns in the world, it means, maybe with a little bit of creativity, innovation, that we can get at the heart of some of these challenges. Haiti needs a new governing disposition. Haiti needs a new social contract, and Haiti needs some tools of transparency and rigorous accountability. In one of the first meetings that I had with Ambassador Foote following his appointment to Haiti, we had a long conversation on that occasion. And at the end of it, he said to me, what is it that you want? What is it that the diaspora wants? What is it that Haitian people want in this moment? And I said, Ambassador, it's simple. We just want time. We are in a circumstance where the core group is insisting on racing to elections, racing to a particular form of stability that disadvantages any pathway towards democracy. I said we need time. And Ambassador Foote, to his everlasting credit, said, I will do everything that I can to grant Haitian civil society not just an audience, but the respect of that time. And we can see how that was thwarted. I'd like to remind American policymakers who may be watching our conversation today that democracy making is a full contact sport. It is as messy as sausage making. And even a mature democracy like the United States has its own continued seismic eruptions around democracy making, as we all saw, as the world saw on January 6th. If the US struggles with these issues without foreign impositions, can you imagine what Haiti goes through all the time? So we need a new governing disposition, a new social contract that considers the needs of the struggling and not the elite. And then if I could, as I close, Jacqueline, I want to suggest that we need something concrete. We have we have the extraordinary leadership of Haitian civil society that has shown a courage that is unimaginable to me. And they've created this accord, but I want to suggest that foreign actors, the core group, Haiti, USAID, civil society should lift up a Haiti development fund modeled to the kind of intervention that was put in place in Iraq following the tribulations there. A Haiti development fund that has in it governance of Haitian governmental actors, legitimate and authentic, Haitian civil society actors, legitimate and authentic, donor groups, international organizations that takes up in a very, very concrete way the alignment of the profusion of aid into the country with calendared budgets with clearly delineated and expressed goals to create a more basic provision of goods and services in the country is absolutely positively essential and needs to walk hand in hand with a new governance disposition. And I hope that as we get into the question and answer period, we'll have an opportunity to go further into the question of those kinds of mechanisms. Thank you all.
All right, Patrick, thank you very much. Based on your opening remarks, I'm actually going to put some of my questions aside because I want to pick up where Patrick left off, issues that were raised by Amy. Juan Valdez, when you were there at the head of MINUSTA, Michel Pied-Louis as a former prime minister. And I'm going to put out a question that I think that each one of you are part of the puzzle to helping us understand what happened. In 2004, we heard talk about a social contract, that this was a moment of a social contract, Group 184. What happened to that social contract? Then we had an interim government picked, interesting enough, by a council of wise men, 7 Haitians. Ironically enough, the current interim prime minister was one of them. It was an application process. The person who emerged out of that was a member of the diaspora, Gérard Latortue. And then Juan Gabriel, I remember in 2006, after the election of René Préval, hearing the gunshots in the streets because it was the first time that MINUSTA was actually able to go after the gangs because there was an elected government. So I wonder, in terms of a transition, whether it lasts a week, 3 years, how do you tackle this gang problem with a government that is not elected? And I think you referenced this earlier this year in a statement that you made for the dialogue about, sort of that legitimacy and where it comes from. And Amy, I'm wondering, what went wrong? Again, I'm remembering 2006, the US Embassy was very much involved in cleaning up the books of the finance ministry. Henri Bazin got rid of all of the zombie checks. And there was this sort of a fear, right, from the embassy. And now we're back to what Juan Gabriel described as sort of supporting undemocratic moves at all costs. And so I want to start, Patrick, with you. As a member of the Obama administration, this moment that we are in is not unique. In 2006, when we had the first migration surge of Haitians to the Tijuana border, President Obama, his DHS, removed the moratorium on deportations, and we started seeing Haitians deported en masse to Haiti. There was no Title 42, of course, but I am having a bad case of deja vu after, going onto the border. So I would like for you to sort of take us.
If you're starting with me, Lynn,
starting with you into those conversations.
That history is too brief. That history is too brief. With deepest respect, this is not. We have had a kind of dismissive, patronizing attitude in the relationship between U.S. And Haiti that goes back generations across administrations, irrespective of the political party of the individual in charge of the White House at the time. When I started here in this conversation, I mentioned those who were recently murderously executed in Haiti. We could go back to Charlemagne Perrault, who was executed by US Marines during that occupation, walk through the horrific decisions that have been made by Democratic and Republican administrations that have absolutely upended rural agriculture in Haiti, whether it's the decisions that were made around pigs in Haiti, or horrific decisions made about the exportation and importation of rice in Haiti, to what's occurred with deportations. That's across decades, it is across presidencies, and it's across political parties. There's a way that Haiti has been a kind of tool that's been used in one euphemistic war after another. We all understand how Duvalier was propped up when he was a convenient tool against the Castro regime. And we should all understand that there is a relationship between the Petrocaribe corruption that we've seen, that has been blessed and that actors have looked the other way on, and the fact that the United States had a keen interest in the future of governance in Venezuela, and needed Haiti and its then president to take up certain decisions within the OAS. There's an interrelatedness between all these things, and Haiti has been a pawn. So I appreciate the question about the deportations in 2010. I appreciate the fact that I was part of an administration that launched the Haitian Family Reunification Act in 2014 that was then reversed by Trump. But irrespective of party and leadership, we've seen this kind of treatment for Haiti. I just believe, Jacqueline, that we're at a point now where, as a consequence of the maturity, the sophistication, and the courage of Haitian civil society, and the maturity of Haitian diaspora, and the due deference that diaspora plays to that Haitian civil society, and an appreciation of our importance in states like Florida, that a new dispensation is possible now if we press the case.
Okay. Amy, whether we go with one accord versus the other, how do we break this cycle in terms of policy being personality driven based on who is sitting at the embassy in Port-au-Prince, whether it's for the US, the French, or whomever?
Well, I mean, like Patrick, I could go and say that, there's a long racist history between the US and Haiti, and that drives a lot of the behaviors, like saying, oh, c'est Haiti, quand même, c'est Haiti. This racist idea that somehow you can do anything in Haiti and do whatever you want to Haiti. So that it's a long, long history. And I agree with Patrick that there is a new maturity on the part of what might be called opposition right now, but what is really Haitian society, about taking the reins of governance and trying to move forward with them. But I do think that has to be paralleled by a new maturity on the part of the Americans to say, okay, we're always feeling, I think the Americans are, that Haiti's a toxic time bomb waiting to go off. You never know what bad thing is going to happen. But what I was trying to say in my opening remarks is that we've made it into the toxic time bomb. We are the reason why those people end up at Del Rio, because we're supporting the wrong kind of people whom we've been supporting since the beginning of the 1900s. Face it, these are people who help with business in Haiti, who run a lot of stuff and grease the wheels of the way things used to work, but things don't work that way anymore. Inequality has gotten too bad. The agricultural base of Haitian society is gone. We have these a country of slums in a certain way, just the way there is becoming a planet of slums because of income inequality. And a lot of those basic problems have to be adjusted, and I think then the cult of personality will go away. I know that Mickey Martelly was popular in a way, but he certainly soon became unpopular. His wasn't an easy vote. And with Jovenel, I was not aware at any moment that he was deeply beloved, not like Papa Doc even, when he was deeply beloved, and that he was basically highly unmourned when he was assassinated. So I'm not sure that this problem of personality is so important in Haitian elections anymore. I think what the Haitian people really want to hear in Creole, which is what they speak, is that they are being heard and they are being listened to and they are being cared for by a government that will do things for them. Come on, the government hasn't done anything for them in all these years. When I went back to Haiti, the last time I was there was the end of 2019, and it had been like a year before that, and everything was so much worse for the Haitian people. So it's the disaster has to be reversed. I think good governance, good budgetary rules are without question terribly important. But I think that both the Haitian people, Haitian civil society, and the Haitian diaspora have reached a point of maturity and of no return. Like, we cannot go on with this. And
Michelle,
it's pushing us forward.
Michelle, do you agree with that assessment? Do you think that Haitians are at a point, young Haitians especially, where they are ready to believe in democracy again, and they are ready to vote not with their feet or not by selling their vote, but to really take charge and reverse course?
I have mute. I was mute. So this is a very interesting question, because you see, after the departure of Duvalier, people in Haiti, young people across the board, across social and economic barriers, wanted to participate. They wanted to vote for the first time in their lives. And they understand very well what the one man, one woman, one vote of President Mandela meant. That meant political equality. And this is what has been constantly refused to the Haitian people. And Juan Gabriel just mentioned it since Congressman Levine mentioned it, since 1987 for the first elections. So people do understand what it means. It means coming out of marginalization. It means participating. But this is constantly refused by the choices that are made by the international community until today. And that has been expressed by Patrick, by Amy, and by all the participants in this panel. So the big question is, can the treatment that we all talked about can change? Can we be seen differently as mature citizens, men and women who can participate? Jovenel Moïse was elected with less than 500,000 votes when we have over 4.5 million voters. Is that legitimacy? People
Why do you think that happened
under those conditions? And when there are 150, candidates, and no debates, no programs, what do you want them to vote for? They don't want to vote under those conditions. But believe me, young people, I teach at the university, I can tell you, they want to participate. But if this continues, they will leave the country. And migration will again be a big, big issue, mostly for the US, because as Juan Gabriel said, most of the people under the Del Rio Bridge came from either Brazil or Chile. They don't even want to stay in Brazil and Chile. So this is the question. I know we're going to have a delegation from, I don't know if it's the White House tomorrow. Can the treatment that we constantly get be changed by Haitians and by the Haitian diaspora? That's the question.
Juan Gabriel, 2017, 100,000 Haitians, 1% of the country's population migrated to Chile. I was there, I talked to them. And I remember being struck by the similar history in terms of the dictatorship with Chile and Haiti, but then the different paths. Today, when we're looking at Haiti with collapsed institutions and the crisis, what can Chile teach Haiti, or how do we get out of this?
Let me refer first to what you were saying before. I refer to the idea of what happened in 2004, 2005, when I was there with MINUSTA, and when we decided at a certain point that the only way to confront the gangs was with the support of a legitimate government. And even if we worked in very good conditions with the government of Boniface Alexandre and Gérard Latortue, who made enormous efforts in order to pacify the country and create some space for everybody in the country, I think that what the MINUSTA did at the beginning was possible because Preval was seen as legitimately elected, and this is important. I have to say too, something that is almost a personal confession, that I felt at the time that one of the reasons why we were able to work in such a degree of freedom and this political decisions with the transitional government was because the US was in Iraq. And it was not in capacity to occupy itself with what was really going on inside Haiti. I think that the situation changed when President Clinton was elected, when Hillary Clinton became foreign affairs chief, and when Preval had to organize elections after the earthquake. And as you know, there was an open intervention by the OAS and by the American government in the result of these elections. I was there at the time. I was not chief of MINUSTA. I was just somebody sent by different groups of people who were friends of Haiti. And I remember very well the conversations with René Preval in the palace that had been destroyed, reflecting and telling us how he had been pressured by international forces in order to leave the place and call for elections and generate a situation which was not what really the Haitian people wanted in the middle of a catastrophe as happened in 2010. Therefore, as you have mentioned, this is something that is in the origin, I believe, of what is going on right now, and most of you had alluded to it, have alluded to it, and I think it's something extremely important to keep in mind at present. Now, when you're telling me about the Chile and Haiti, when I came to Haiti at the time, in 2004, I believe that Chile and Argentina and other countries in the Southern Cone had some examples, had some lessons that could be used in the Haitian context. I mean, transition from authoritarian dictatorships and democracy, and other sort of, particularly the struggle for human rights and the struggle to constitute a government without the use, a democratic government without the use of violence. And that seemed to be very important at the time. However, I realized that the complexity of the Haitian society was much more than what I had expected at the beginning. The difficulties to develop a sort of consensus and a sort of political agreement was enormous. Even if we managed to organize these elections in which Preval won in 2005, we never managed to see, we couldn't see a national dialogue. We couldn't see really the will of people to converge towards a common position. And the political class, and particularly the elite, kept itself outside the general process without understanding the importance of, at that moment in which there was a certain level of security and a certain level of political development, to create the conditions to establish strong institutions and develop strong institutions. However, to finish with this point, I think there is now an example that has to be considered, or the possibility of looking at Chile in another way from Haiti. 2 years ago, Chile had a social explosion. And the result of the social explosion was the convergence towards the new constitution. And this new constitution was the expression of the civil society. This new constitution was the expression of the participation of women, of minorities of all sorts, of people who had been margined from the economy and from the political system, As you know, the convention that is writing the constitution was totally elected. And now the country is in a difficult situation. It is not in a situation of complete optimism, but it is evident that the example of this process reinforces my conviction that you need some time in order to convene, to reflect, to be able to think about the future of the country in strategic terms. This is what is happening now in Chile. It might be an example for those who are thinking also in the Haitian future. Now, you said, Jacqueline, that you were coming here in the next future. And I think it is important to see the way in which the Haitian community is evolving in Chile, because of course we have lost an enormous amount of people who try to leave to the United States, but we also have an important part of the community that is staying in Chile and is trying to build life in this country. And I think this is also something that should be known and described. Thank you.
Jackie Lamarck, in his opening remarks, talked about the insecurity, the rampant gang problem. And in fact, the same week that Del Rio was unfolding, UN agencies basically said that 400,000 Haitians had not received aid because gangs had blocked the road to the south. The president of Dominican Republic, who is Abinader, last week basically called for external intervention. He was not specific, but he basically said that the crisis in Haiti cannot be solved by Haiti alone. And I want to ask each of you, in terms of solving this, and should there be a return of a UN military force in Haiti, or what is the solution to tackling the gang problem? Amy, I'll start with you.
Aren't you generous? I think that the feeling among the people I know in Haiti is so strongly anti-intervention. Their experience of MINUSTA is not a good experience. I don't think they want an international force on the ground. I don't think they want an American force on the ground. I do think that to deal with the gang situation and the blockage of the economy, the impossibility of getting, relief stuff to people who need relief and reconstruction, or of getting gasoline out to the country. The gangs one day decided they would stop that. I wasn't sure what the motivation was for that, but they did stop gas and diesel shipments from going around the country for a while. So I feel like, one of those small, sort of honed, well-trained, super armed, 30-person, not too big, not too scary for the general public, but scary enough to the gangs that when they arrive on the scene, the gangs go, this is not the Haitian National Police, to help train the Haitian National Police. I know that has been tried many times before and has not exactly succeeded, but I think, a small, highly trained training force, maybe international, maybe American, would be useful. I think that this has been thought about. I don't know what has been people's feeling about it, but rather than putting, serious boots on the ground, I feel that would be not a good step toward elections. But I do feel the gangs have to be neutralized before you can have elections. I wouldn't go out and vote with those people outside with all their arms and their vehicles, and I don't think the Haitians would either.
Thank you. Patrick.
Yeah, that's a simple no, Jacqueline. Look, I agree with everything that Amy just said, both about the challenges of having any kind of a successful intervention and the reality of what Haitians experience under previous interventions that just make that a non-starter. It is critical, however, given the state of not just gang, we talk about gang violence in Haiti without recognizing that that gang violence is part and parcel and extension of the politics in the country. Let's remember, it was not that long ago that we had a senator in Haiti step out of the parliament, pull a gun out of his breast pocket, fired it, shot a journalist, and went on with his business. There's a way in which there's kind of a mafia state that's taken hold here, and the confederation of gangs under President Moise is an extension of the act of politics in the country, and that has to be recognized. There is in the past, during Minister, there was a successful vetting of police forces in the country, training and vetting, that led to a significant reduction in corruption, in state-sponsored violence, and it led to something of a turnaround. You know, this stuff, I think, is this stuff. This challenge, I think, is heavily reported and yet under-examined. There are other nations in the region that have had similar situations with being overrun with drugs, being overrun with cartels that have turned themselves around. 20 years ago, we could have been having this same conversation about Colombia and the city of Medellin. Medellin was the drug capital of the world, the murder capital of the world. I've been to Colombia, and I saw the space where the mafia shot into the Supreme Court in Colombia, and the place was just determined to be ungovernable and unrulable. And now, if you go to Medellin, it is like a space of innovation for climate, for economic inclusion that happened in one generation as a consequence of significant infrastructure investment that was made in the country that opened up routes of access from rural parts of the country to the urban economy for those who had been previously desperate and engaged in the gang warfare. There was a new dispensation on governance and constitutionalism that accompanied that. And over a 10 to 15 year period, we saw the transformation that led to the Renaissance in Colombia. Additionally, the US played a critical role as well in the training of policing there and the vetting out of corruptive forces. So this has been done in much more in complicated spaces, in countries with larger populations. There's just a question here as to whether or not there's a political will that exists to take on this task.
Michelle and Juan Gabriel, I'm thinking, when I'm hearing Amy and Patrick, I'm also thinking about the low morale inside the police force, thinking about what led to, the whole Phantom 509. I'm thinking about a report I just did with the president and how none of his guards were even willing to go inside the house when the shooting started. So I'm just wondering, your thoughts on how do we solve it, and whether or not the Haitian police would be accepting of some small militia foreign force coming in to go after the gangs. Michelle.
Okay.
Let me. All right. The question of the police is very important because the police has been highly politicized and it's nothing new. But what Patrick said is very important because in my conversation with Daniel Foote, the special envoy, that was his idea, indeed. How can the US in his position, create a special force in the police that will tackle the gang issue? And from what he said to me personally when I met him, his appeal to the government and even to the Pentagon were refused. But I think that for the past, I would say maybe 20 years, the police chief has been chosen by the Americans until the last, So their interference in the police is very crude, And I believe they know very well the level of corruption, the level of complicity with the gangs, and the fact that, I think that was even revealed by the chief of the USGPN, who is in jail now and who's been confessing that he was involved in gang and traffic of arms and drugs on behalf of both the government and the gangs. So the complicity is there, and it is true that a vetting process would be very important, but it has to be efficient. And I don't think that the police is in a position to refuse the chief being chosen by the Americans themselves. So, but it is a real issue because, as everyone has said in this panel, there cannot be elections if we don't tackle the issue of gangs. But at the same time, we have to also realize the complicity and the fact that it is the dysfunctional of the whole institutions, and the fact that there probably are complicities also elsewhere in Haitian society that created the situation of the insecurity we are living in today in Haiti.
I would think US diplomats would say that the only police officer that is vetted is the police chief, who's chosen by the president and vetted by the US embassy. And it's become a stop measure to prevent the corruption from going to the top. But yes, leadership is definitely required, as well as funding. Juan Gabriel Valdez, your thoughts as a former head of MINUSTA, should there be another UN peacekeeping force, or how do you tackle the insecurity problem in Haiti today, primarily the gangs?
Well, as everybody has said, my answer is no. I believe that it wouldn't be convenient to do that in the present circumstances, and I think that my reflection is around the strength of the civilian and the legitimate power that could come out from this effort done by the civil society. If you have a legitimate president that can talk to the gangs and tell them, if you don't proceed to disarm and to stop criminal activities, I will have this force here to come on you. If you have that situation, then I would not be against the president, that legitimate president, asking for support to confront the gangs. Now, the problem is, how do you manage to organize elections in the climate of violence that you have now? Of course, as Amy said, the idea of organizing an election with the level of power and control that the gangs have over Port-au-Prince and the rest of the country is practically inconceivable. But you have to have a group of people who can threaten the gangs, who can threaten the gangs, and if not the elected president, the group of people who are organizing the process of elections and are organizing a return to a legitimate situation in the country, political situation in the country, should have or must have the possibility of telling the gangs, we will proceed against you and we have the power to do it. This is something that the US should consider. And this is something that all other friends of the US should consider. I think that there was a moment in which the possibility of having a different police seemed possible, seemed something that could be realized in the immediate future. I remember, I will tell something about the time, an anecdote about that time. I remember when Prime Minister Latortue called me saying, I know that you're going to Rome for personal reasons. Mario Andresol is there. Could you talk to him? And I spoke to Mario Andresol, and I convinced him that he could return to Haiti and be chief of the police. And he came back, and I have no idea if he was vetted or not by the American ambassador at the time. I suppose they were consulted. But the fact is that at that time, there was a police that could respond and that seemed to be able to confront the gangs. Of course, it worked with the forces of MINUSTA and particularly with the group of Canadian policemen that were there. But it was an experience that could be, that gives the hope that you will not always have a country and a police that will depend on foreign presence and on foreign military. You must create in Haiti a police that is independent and has some level of control over the population. And I think that is possible to do, and we should try to do it.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question from our audience. What would you say to someone who argues that strengthening democratic institutions and tackling gang violence are long-term problems, and that waiting to hold elections until these problems are resolved or even marginally improved means elections won't happen anytime soon, potentially leaving a legitimacy gap that stands to undermine the very efforts some of you have advocated for. Who would like to take that question? Amy?
I'll do it quickly. I think that you cannot have a legitimate election if you have gangs in the streets. How do you do it? How do you possibly do it? And those gangs are not just gangs, they're manipulated by political factions. Then you have the same thing happening that is happening right now with US approval. And I think if the US removes its approval of these things, that will be a step toward eliminating the gangs system. That will begin that step, but you cannot have legitimate elections in this situation, I don't think. I cede my place.
Can I just quickly add to Amy, yeah. And it's just an amplification. That last point that Amy just made about the endorsement of international actors, most especially the US, cannot be overstated. We have seen policy on the ground in Haiti literally change overnight based on a new pronouncement from the US State Department or a tweet from the US Embassy. There is a way in which actors who are participating in the most violent activity in Haiti believe that they have the confidence and the reassurance that they have legitimacy and the blessings of institutions and other nation states. Thwarting that requires a different kind of messaging from the US and the rest of the core group. And I think that that's going to accelerate the kind of openings that are needed to then create a pathway towards legitimate elections. Let's recall that the last election that was held in Haiti had historically the lowest amount of participation that we've ever seen. And that's a direct result of the random acts of violence that are not that random, that are all strategic and are quite political.
Okay. We have another.
Add something, Jacqueline. Mm-hmm. It is true that the gang is a major issue, but as you said at the beginning of your presentation, Patrick, what we need is time, because it is not just the gang situation, it's the dysfunctional of all the institutions, including the electoral body. So how are we going to, restore the rule of law when the whole judicial system has collapsed? And these are real issues that happened in the past, 10 years. Real dysfunction of all our institutions, which also led to the situation with the gangs and the police. So it's really how time do we have to restore what needs to be restored so that we can have legitimate elections? And this is really the question we have to ask ourselves, even the civil society organizations.
We're running a little bit over, but I wanted to wrap it up. And to your point, here is a question from someone who is Haitian. What or who are we calling Haitian civil society? Why me, as a Haitian person, should give them the right to decide for millions? Listening to all the statements, yet no one on this panel addressed rule of law in the form of accountability, where arrest for corrupt politicians in private sectors is at the core of moving the country forward and change the situation we are in. Every law, from the number of political parties, for examples, are the policies that give rise to a failed state. And I would like for each of you to address that, and also a brief closing remark. And I want to thank our audience for being, for being with us. And hopefully you got more out of the introductions than the questions. Thank you. I'll start with Juan Gabriel Valdez. Who is civil society and why should they have the power to decide for millions?
I think that what we have seen in recent months, the organization of a group of people who were able, in the middle of this chaotic and difficult situation, to come out and make a call to the country for a dialogue, and make a call for the international community to understand that they should hear Haitians before deciding themselves what to do. This merits the name of civil society organization, and this should appeal to all Haitians to participate in a process of national dialogue. I believe that they have deserved the name. And their courage is enormous, and I think that they should be recognized as leaders in a society which has lost a lot of hope. I can understand perfectly well the question in reference to issues like accountability, justice, participation. I think I mentioned in my opening remarks, a quote from Michaëlle Jean, in which she said that the masses in the streets that were protesting against the former president, Moïse, were precisely calling for accountability, were precisely calling for transparency and for justice. And I think this is also civil society participating in a different way. Therefore, the convergence of these people in the streets and the people who are trying to organize a process of reflection and a process of decision-making that will lead to a new process of democratic elections, I think, and will take their time to do that. I think this is what should be called civil society and should, I hope, receive the support of all of us.
Thank you. Amy?
Yeah, I remember the days when I hated this word civil society, and I felt that it was, an elite term to hand over power. This was in Panama, to take over power by an elite that already had power. Here, I don't feel that, partly because this document that has been worked out with such energy and really in scary circumstances where people tried to destroy it, was worked out with a lot of people I really respect. It's not just the high levels of civil society who are known figures like Michel, who was a former prime minister of Haiti, but it's grassroots communities who've signed on, it's groups of cultivators in the countryside, organizers from the bidonville, labor, teachers, doctors, lawyers, the essence of Haitian society that still is in Haiti, students, and people who organized some of the Côté Cob Petro-Caraïbe demonstrations, the giant demonstrations in the past year. So I think this is a document signed by Haiti. And I think that we're talking about something much broader than you're usually talking about when you just say civil society. This is the Commission for a Haitian Solution to the Crisis. And it understands that one of the main problems in Haiti has been that civil society hasn't been broadly inclusive before. It's an attempt to way broaden what is meant by that term. I understand the question. I think it's a legitimate question, but I think things have changed, I hope.
Thank you, Patrick.
I appreciate the spirit with which that question is lifted up, and I appreciate the skepticism in it as well. But I just want to push back against it and say that this is not a civil society that's deciding on behalf of the larger population. This is instead a broad cross-section of Haitian society, from labor unions to political parties to faith-based organizations and to former gang leaders themselves, who have come together in the same orbit, who are creating a more kind of broadly shared consensus about what the future ought to look like, what peace, security looks like in the country, and most especially what economic inclusion and advancement needs to look like as well. And it's all about creating the architecture for a pathway towards much more inclusive democratic governance. That's the whole the entire essence of this, and that's what gives me a tremendous amount of hope. I also want to just quickly say, Jacqueline, that earlier in one of the questions that you posed, there was this sense that because past civil society journeys have not entirely succeeded, that perhaps we should have less faith in this one. As I said in the beginning, democracy is not something that occurs overnight. It is a full contact sport, an arduous journey, and one learns and improves from one exercise of it to the next, from one campaign to the next. I think that we can all agree that the current state of play in politics in Haiti and in the economy in Haiti does not benefit the mass of Haitians. Furthermore, the current international aid framework lacks coherence, deprives Haitians of agency without effectively preventing corruption, and offers little prospect for graduation to the next level of development. So when your questioner says, well, no one on this panel has spoken about corruption and elite accountability, we have. In my opening statement, I actually proposed a framework for how we get at that very question. But this can't just be about arresting one corrupt individual or another. It's about lifting up an entire new paradigm for the dispensation of aid. Right now, the next time there's another flashpoint in the crisis in Haiti, you'll turn on your television, you'll see on CNN former politicians from Haiti who are absolutely complicit in both the corruption and the violence in an unaccountable way on TV, on American television, answering as if they are thoughtful statesmen without any interrogation about what their role has been in the past. And I believe that the structure of the current commission, the journey they're on, plus a different kind of push around what international aid looks like can create those modes of accountability. Thank you so much for engaging this conversation. I hope this will be one of many.
Thank you. Michelle, you're a member of civil society, but I have another question for you. And as the person in Port-au-Prince, and you work so close to the population, and even before this earthquake and people knew where Lekai was, you've always been close to people in the outskirts. But Haiti is a society that's deeply divided. And one of the things that struck me with the Del Rio was the noise, the concerns I heard were more out of the diaspora than out of the country itself. So tomorrow, this group takes over. How do we address those divisions in the country? And how do we, I don't know if we can ever get rid of it, but you minimize the power play, the jockeying for power that we all know takes place in Haitian society that often becomes complicit, that is complicit in where the country is today?
That's a very difficult question to answer. But you see, I work with a lot of grassroots organizations, a lot of smallholder organizations, small, women organizations throughout the country. And what's important is an understanding of our own history, which is so badly taught everywhere, even at the university. And the need for a new narrative, because even now we're talking about, a Haitian solution. We need time, we need a vision, but we need a new narrative about this country, its history, and its relationship to the Caribbean and to the United States. And in my own experience, I can see how when you have discussions, even sometimes with, practically illiterate peasants and farmers, how acutely they understand those issues and how they can bring their own understanding to this situation. So it is true that the society is divided. It is true also that our media, Patrick just talked about the media in the US, giving space and role to, politicians in Haiti. But the media here also, and you're a journalist, darn well, the role they play in focusing on mostly, anything that doesn't work. There are lots of things that work in the country. They are not in the open, but at the same time, there's something that is building. There's something that is understanding a better, the role of the, this population for their inscription in the political process and the role that they can play in changing that country. So it is true that when you look at the country, you can feel sometimes extremely pessimistic. But for my own involvement with those organizations that are fighting every day, I cannot be pessimistic. I have to believe in this country. I have to believe in a new vision for this country. And I have to believe in a new narrative for our history, for the future, and for looking at ourselves 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
Thank you. I want to thank each of you for your time and some insightful thoughts. And I want to thank our audience that stayed with us as we went over. And I'm just going to close by something that I'm thinking a lot of as I was preparing for today's panelists. And it's a quote by the anthropologist Michel Rolfe Trouillot. Since birth, the state and the nation went in opposite directions, and it's been very hard throughout history to reconcile their views and to build the confidence that is necessary to build a nation and a state. And I think that this sort of puts us where the trajectory of Haiti is at this moment. So I want to thank each of you again. Michel Pierre-Louis, Patrick Gaspar, Juan Gabriel Valdez, Amy Willens, and to the dialogue, Jackie Lumarck, and Michael Shifter. Thank you again, and thank you for everyone who tuned in. We can talk
And
about.
thank you to you, Madam.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Well done.
Bye.